Are anxiously waiting to hear from the state about whether they'll move forward with lowering the threshold for overtime.
Now, the decision to lower overtime is now in the hands of the Wage Board, and the Department of Labor will address the issue at a meeting on January 4th.
Joining us now live to talk about this is Dr. Richard Stupp, an agricultural workforce specialist at Cornell University. Dr. Stupp, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Let's try to break this issue down, because this is a big one, particularly for the farmers out here in Western New York. The proposal is to drop that threshold from 60 to 40. I have to ask at first, why is that such a big drop that is being proposed? We're talking about 20 hours, which seems very significant.
Well, if I might start off by saying, we don't know for sure what level it could potentially be dropped to. It could be dropped to 40 or any point in between that, or it could be dropped gradually over a period of years. That's entirely unknown at this point. It's really up to while the Wage Board meets and hears testimony, they don't actually decide. It's really up to the governor and the commissioner of labor ultimately, who will make the decision about whether the threshold should be dropped, if at all.
Now, say this happens, there's talks of the livelihood of these farms. Why are some of the employees opposed to reducing this threshold?
So employees, it's not just as simple as employers versus employees in this situation. There are employees certainly that would support lowering the threshold, but there are many employees who would prefer for that threshold to stay right where it is at 60. And the concern that some of those employees have expressed is that they know that overtime, they're not going to get 20 hours of overtime if it dropped to 40. They know that they're not going to get substantial amounts of overtime in any scenario. And so like every business, overtime is very, very expensive. And so every employer will try to avoid paying overtime whenever they can. So in that situation, employees know that instead of being able to work 60 hours like they do now, or more likely around 50 or 55 hours, which most employees do, they know that if the overtime threshold drops to 50, then they might get 50 hours or maybe a few hours of overtime. If it goes to 40, then they're going to get 40 hours of straight time, and then maybe 2 or 3, maybe 5 hours at most of overtime. And so the concern is that for some of those employees, their actual take-home pay, their earnings potential, might actually go down because they have fewer hours available for them to work.
I'm curious, farming is such a small margin business. What could some of these farmers decide to do? What have you heard that they could do if this overtime threshold is moved around? Be it 50, be it 40, be it phased in over time, these farmers will have to change the way they do business, right?
That's absolutely right. And that's a concern both for the farmers and for the people who work for them. So farmers will have to do something. They'll have to radically change their model, their labor model in some way, because again, they can't pay 20 hours of overtime. So what they'll first try to do is hire more employees. And originally, that's what overtime was intended for, was to encourage employers to hire more employees. And so they might try that, but we know that we're in a very short labor environment. Agriculture has struggled for years to find enough employees. So it's going to be very difficult for farms to hire more employees in order to spread those hours out among others. So they'll have to take other alternatives. And what they've talked with us about is things like mechanization or automation. There are some robotics that are available. They're very well established in dairy. And so those are some opportunities to bring robots in the dairy industry, but it's very expensive. In the fruit and vegetable industries, robotics are on the way, but they're really years away at this point. It's not a real viable solution at this point, but it will come eventually. There's opportunities to switch crops, to move from labor-intensive crops like fruits and vegetables to maybe less labor-intensive crops like field crops or grain crops. We have in the Northeast, in New York in particular, dairy and fruit and vegetable, which are all labor-intensive crops. Other parts of the country, many people are familiar with the Midwest, where we have a lot of corn and soybeans. That's all managed with large machinery, with tractors, and with very little labor. And so that's the big difference here, is that we have a lot of labor intensive, a lot of high-value crops and types of farming in the Northeast. but it requires a sufficient labor force to do that.
And Dr. Stuff, briefly, you guys have a study on this very thing. Where can folks find it? Because we are out of time. We won't be able to discuss it.
Okay, you can go to my website, actually. It's agworkforce.cals.cornell.edu, and you can find information and a link to that report.
Very good. We're going to have a link to that on our website, wivb.com. Dr. Richard Stupp, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.